Hey, Richard Meller again here from Facts for Working People. I just was reading this paper this morning, and I see that Trump is cutting aid to Latin America, to Central America, countries like El Salvador, Nicaragua, which are already desperate poverty, lack of opportunity and everything else. I don't know what the aid package is to these places, but it wouldn't be much. Most of the US government's aid abroad is for military reasons and to serve its own interest. But it's cutting whatever little bit of aid there is. And of course, what's this going to do? It's going to make things worse. It's going to force more people to flee in desperation, to feed their children, to find some sort of opportunity, just basically to live. The same thing is happening in Europe, which is why you're getting this migration increase, massive migration from Africa and the Middle East into Europe, and it's thousands and thousands of people have died in the Mediterranean trying to escape this misery. And so a friend of mine was saying to me, well, he's a smart bugger, you know, and because it will feed into his base. His base, more people coming up. He'll use the border again as a reason. Look, there's hordes are coming up. We've got to stop it. We've got to build a wall. We've got to close the border. Whatever he says, send troops and everything else. Of course, why is it that he's not smart at all? But why is it he can get away with that? Why is it that argument works? And it works because, to be honest with you, the incredibly low level of class consciousness in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't occur in other countries. I mean, in Britain, you know, they've whipped up the immigration fear. The Brexit, a lot of Brexit is about that. The immigrants and the Africans and Poles and Lithuanians and everybody else, and being English, the right wing, the fascists of all, and the nationalists have all taken advantage of that. It's a bit of a mixed bag, but that's a large part of it. So it's not that it doesn't happen in other places, but the question of class here is there's such a powerful effort by the state and the media and everything else to completely subjugate class, to downplay the role of class, or even raise that class exists. And in its place, what we have in the United States is rampant identity politics. Now, that doesn't mean, before people get on me about that, it doesn't mean we don't fight for the oppressed nationalities, for oppressed or marginalized people and communities. Look at the Native Americans, perhaps one of the most abused and marginalized of all. And a person's identity in that way is not important, but it's used in general to undermine the class question and focus on identity. And so it's this low level of class consciousness and not having a class perspective. And part of that class perspective is like a historical materialism. This is why Trump can get away with that, because nobody understands, very few people understand what the cause is, why people are coming north. And what historical materialism is, especially to Marxists and socialists, is seeing human society and the development of human society as caused by material things, not by the ideas in people's heads, not by religious stuff or anything like that, but the changes and in the material world, that there's a real material cause. And what's the material cause for us there? And that material cause is the role that the United States imperialism, capitalism develops and spreads into the rest of the world, and that's what the US has done. It's invaded, it's dominated. You've only got to remember that quote by Smedley Butler about his role in Central America. So those countries there have never been able to develop because of the power of American imperialism that has plundered and robbed them for a couple of centuries. And the same is in Britain. It's the same around the world. It's the same in Britain. I had no idea of the role of Britain in Ireland, even though I was raised Catholic. I grew up in Catholic schools, going to Catholic schools. I never fully understood why the situation was in Ireland in the 60s when I worked with Irish people. Ireland was basically a peasant country. I'd meet people that couldn't read, could barely write, came from villages where they'd never left. They came into England to look for work. Some of them were brought in by scrupulous Irish and English contractors, British contractors. But I didn't understand the dynamics behind it, and that Ireland was Britain's first colony, and it could never develop out without being everything, its relationship to the rest of the world, particularly its economics and its products and its everything else, was done through English and British capitalism. So that country was never able to develop, and the practices it took never able to develop a healthy capitalist state along the lines of England or France or Germany and things like that. And so there were real explanations. When they split the country in 1921, the British, as British imperialism was weakening, it came out of the First World War. Britain did really its rule of the world was over, and it partitioned the country and kept the north, those counties that we know as Ulster and Northern Ireland now, because that's where the industry was. That's where the shipbuilding was. The Titanic was built there, and so forth. And then it became a burden on it. I remember my father saying, "Oh, we spend $5 billion a year trying to keep the peace over there with Catholics and Protestants. What's the matter with them?" There were real material conditions that are the answers to these questions. And if you take the nation state, we live in a modern nation state, England, France. I never understood that the nation state arose and it was a product of capitalism. Germany was not a unified nation, I think, in total, until 1861, after the revolution of the middle of the 19th century, 1848 or so. France, 1789. The English Revolution advanced the formation of the nation state, which are geographical and economic areas that are a product of the capitalist mode of producing wealth, which is different to the feudal and to slavery. And so when you see these the immigrants and the crisis in Central America, and also in all of the colonial countries, former colonial countries, we are taught in the first world, they're not going to say, well, we plundered them. The British bourgeois, the British ruling class, and say, well, we stole about $45 trillion from India over 2 centuries or so, and India was never able to develop along the lines of a modern capitalist nation state. They didn't say, well, Africa, we plundered it, and the British were in the control of the slave trade, British capital. They didn't say, well, we stole 20 million people, we killed 10 million of them, whatever. Most of them were between 15 and 35, so they took out the human element. Then they plundered all the resources. They're not going to say that to us. So that's where racism, like with the Irish, before people of colour came, because they look a little more like us, so they can use them then. But the Irish were always, they're dirty, they breed too much, have too many kids, they're lazy, they're stupid, all of these things. The British called them the savage race, or white chimpanzees, as I've said before. So that was the development. That's why these countries were never able to develop. And so one guy talked to me about how, and sometimes the petty bourgeois often will, nationalists will, and they hate people with black skin, they hated people with brown skin, they went into Africa because of their black people and all this. Well, they had 7-year-old white kids in factories and mines in Britain. They don't like white skin, it's not a question of that, it's a political question. But the thing is, what capitalism did, it has to have markets, it has to develop markets. And I'm speaking to workers like myself that were at the place I was 30, 40 years ago, is read the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto explains this in detail. It's a small pamphlet. Throw that word out. The Stalinists have harmed that word. He wrote that book and gave it that name long before the Soviet Union and Stalinism and everything else. Okay? So what did they do when they went into these countries? They developed the same mode of production, the same laws, the same structure. That's why when you look at Africa, I lived in Nigeria as a child. My dad was in the British Army. If you look at Africa, what did they do? They created these nation states. Look at them, particularly up north. They're very angular. England as a nation state, Germany as a nation state, France as a nation state, arose organically out of the womb of the feudal society and developed organically from within. Libya, Tunisia, Guinea-Bissau, South Africa, all of these countries Kenya. That used to be East Africa, British East Africa. Kenya, Tanzania, all of these countries were drawn up by the British and other European colonial powers in order to, as they occupied and plundered the African continent. Of course, they plundered Scotland. There's very few trees in Scotland. They cut them all down. This is not a racial issue. Racial questions are aside to it. That it has to, if you're going to occupy a people, rob them, they're the majority and you're not, you have to demonize them. And they do that with their own working class as well. There's that great scene in Becket, in the film Becket, where the king and the the Archbishop of Canterbury, he gives her a young peasant girl and he's feeling her hair and he's talking to her, she's an it. That's how they see people. And so if you look at workers like myself, you got to look at history this way, because it's the truth. That's why Marx is demonized. That's why socialism is demonized. That's why when you look at Africa and all those nation states, they were nation states created from without. And within them, like Nigeria, there's something like 200 different dialects and languages. And there's the Hausa Fulani, there's the Igbo, there's the Yoruba, there's other different tribes. And then they drew these borders and they were all in there. And when they left, they knew there would be chaos of sorts. And I thought it stopped, sorry. And so it's the same in the Middle East. The British and the French drew up a lot of the Iraq, Syria. Those were drawn up by nation states, drawn up by colonial powers. And they were all different tribal groupings. They didn't have borders, no more than the Europeans had borders during tribal society. This is the cause of the crisis. There are material conditions that cause these crises. That's what it is. And when we understand that, we can see why things are happening. It's nothing to do with the devil and Satan and God battling it on the earth and cherubs or any of these things. It's to do with real concrete things. And, you know, when Marx talked about workers of the world unite, it sounds harmless enough, but not to them, not to the ruling classes. It doesn't sound harmless. They recognize what it means. We have more in common with the immigrant coming up from Latin America, just we don't speak the same language. If you're a worker here in the United States and you went to live in Brazil and you were a plumber like me, do you think you'd be hanging around with the daughter of the supermarket owner in Rio? No, I don't think so. I don't think so. So the question is, we have to see why this is happening. And I just wanted to say that because for years I go back to where I was at one point, trying to figure out why do Catholics and Protestants not like each other? What's going on over there? But the way they teach us, they have to use racial elements. Latin American dictators, they can't govern. The blacks in South Africa, they can't govern. There's no explanation of history to us, because once we understand history, it opens our eyes from a historical materialist point of view that conditions change, how human society changes, and on the basis of material conditions. That's what causes things. It's nothing magical. It's concrete. I hope this makes a little bit of sense. It's good for me. And I remember myself when I was back some time ago for 35, 40 years and how I thought about the world. So anyway, if you've got any questions or you've got any comments, comment on the video or contact us. We are active in politics to the limits of our resources. And so that's about that. Richard Miller, Facts for Working People. Talk to you later.